Before we start today's dialogue, we should acknowledge that what we're talking about is an unfolding human crisis and indeed a catastrophe. And with reports of apparent war crimes coming out of Ukraine, where we've seen apparent mass killings by Russian soldiers of Ukraine civilians, that absolutely is front and center of all of our minds. But our job today is to dissect the cyber dimension of this conflict and its implications for us. And to kick us off, before I introduce our really special guests, I'm going to throw to one of our lead analysts in the CyberCX Cyber Intelligence teams, Claudia Muller, for an update on the current state of play of the Ukraine-Russia war.
Thanks, Katherine. Good morning. This morning, I will be briefing you on 3 different types of threat actors, how they have responded to the Russia-Ukraine war, and what this means for Australia and New Zealand. Starting with nation-state actors, namely Russian state-sponsored actors. We assess that it is highly unlikely that Russian intelligence or military cyber threat actors would target deliberately Australian or New Zealand organisations. In general, Australia and New Zealand remain as a low strategic priority for Russia compared to other countries such as NATO members and other nations throughout Europe. Australia and New Zealand have indeed increased their support for Ukraine over the course of the conflict, but nonetheless, this has been in step with other nation states that are of more strategic relevance to Russia. The cyber intelligence team has been tracking how the cyber attacks against Ukraine by Russia have evolved over the course of indeed the conflict itself, but also the lead up to the conflict. And we've noticed one key trend, that being that at the very beginning of the conflict starting to build up, so in the lead up to the invasion in the first couple of months, attacks were very much destructive in nature. In the immediate lead up and the aftermath of the invasion, or the ongoing aftermath of the invasion, I should say, the attacks moved to being destructive in nature. That looking like in January, for example, there were 2 malicious pieces of software that were distributed around Ukraine targets that were wiper malware that were destructive in nature. Comparatively, after the invasion on 24th of February, there have been at least 5 of these types of malware, and at least one of those has been wormable in nature across local networks. At the moment, for the last weeks, I should note that we've observed a plateau in cyber activity from Russia against Ukraine. It's important to note that so that we're balanced in what our intelligence assessments are, but I also want to caveat that as it doesn't necessarily indicate the real state of play. There could be a number of reasons that we are seeing a plateau at the moment that could simply boil down to something like the reporting hasn't emerged yet, or the effects of the malicious cyber activity haven't yet manifested. I also want to note that over the entire period of time that we've been tracking these developments, there has been a very strong element of information warfare that has underlined everything else that Russia is doing. So in terms of one of those destructive malware examples, I will talk about briefly a cyber attack that we believe to be the most significant attack that has come out of the conflict so far. And that was an attack against a US-based satellite provider called Viasat. Viasat also happens to be a US and UK military contractor. What happened was on the 24th of February, as Russia was invading Ukraine, there was a significant satellite facilitated internet communications outage across Europe, primarily in about 6 countries that we know of, mostly in Ukraine, but also across France, Germany, the UK, and a couple of others. What happened in this incident was that, as far as we know from the current details that we have in front of us, that a threat actor compromised Viasat and then got into their system and pushed out another type of destructive malware through to their downstream customers and their modems. This impacted about 30,000 people and also a further 6,000 odd wind turbines across Central Europe, including their SCADA monitoring systems. The reason that we find this attack to be so significant, particularly for Australia and New Zealand and the implications there, is because it demonstrates that highly likely Russian nation-state actors are both willing and capable to target non-Ukrainian services to impact Ukraine, but also with little regard for how that could flow over into other countries, such as I mentioned, France, Germany, the UK, and not to mention that this was a US organisation to begin with. Regarding this type of destructive attack, we assess that there's a real chance of spillover to Australian and New Zealand organisations. The risk is particularly elevated for organisations that operate in Ukraine and NATO countries, that operate in the energy and financial services sectors, and also that are heavily reliant on operational technology. Russia has a history of being, Russia has a history of being reckless with cyber tools. For example, in 2017, its NotPetya attack against Ukraine ended up spreading across the world. It did eventually come to Australia and disrupt Australian organisations as well. A final note before I move over onto the other types of threats is that the spillover could also come from a more business continuity angle. So for example, an Australian or New Zealand organisation could be impacted by any form of impact to their third and fourth party suppliers and vendors that are across the world if they happen to be caught up in the cyber crossfire. Moving into hacktivists and cyber criminals now. Since the conflict began, we have been tracking approximately 25 pro-Ukraine and 10 pro-Russia cyber criminals and activists that are distinct from nation-state threat actors. We assess that there's a real chance that targeted pro-Russia activity against Australian and New Zealand organisations involving ransomware, data theft, extortion, and/or denial of service attacks by cyber criminals and also by hacktivists. As a distinct risk as well, we further assess that there is a real chance of an inadvertent spillover of hacktivist attacks from either ideology to Australian and New Zealand organisations. The basis for this assessment is a trend that we have been tracking called the rise of protestware, which is effectively when software developers, legitimate software developers, take it upon themselves to poison their own software with malicious features and disseminate that to their users in particular countries. An interesting example of how this inadvertently spilled over to an unintended target occurred a few weeks ago. An American NGO, which is actually focused on providing humanitarian aid to victims of authoritarian regimes, had all of its data wiped due to a server that it hosted in Belarus, completely wiped. In a vignette of this kind of incident, a staff member from this organisation commented that this incident from a pro-Ukraine hacktivist did them more damage than Putin or Lukashenko ever could. A final note before I wrap up. The cybercriminal and hacktivist environment from this war has garnered significant media attention. There has been a very high tempo of hacktivist activity, which has really been quite unusual and quite a feature of this war. Our assessment is that this activity has really not been that effective, which is, for those in the cyber community, not all that surprising because hacktivists are considered to be of relatively low sophistication compared to other types of threat actors. Nonetheless, I will leave you with two implications for Australian and New Zealand organisations. The noise that has been generated as a result of this high tempo hacktivist activity has done two things. Firstly, it means that it's very difficult for Australian and New Zealand organisations to accurately and effectively track threats that they are facing. Secondly, it also provides noise and hiding spaces for more serious types of threat actors to disguise their activity. That concludes my briefing. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Claudia. And now we move to the discussion part of this cyber dialogue. And to kick that off, I want to introduce three incredibly interesting guests who we have here to digest the issues. Online and sitting in the UK, we have Ciaran Martin, who is the former director of the NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, in fact, the inaugural director of that organisation, and currently a professor of practice at the Blavatnik School of Public Policy at Oxford University. In the US, we have Admiral Michael Rogers, who is a former a retired four-star general or admiral who served under both Presidents Obama and Trump and was the director of US Cyber Command and also the NSA in the US. And finally, we have Alastair MacGibbon, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at CyberCX and also was the director of the Australian Cyber Security Centre, so the counterpart to Ciaran's NCSC in the UK. Welcome this morning, and we're incredibly privileged to have you, all three of you here, a tripartite pairing of the US, the UK and Australia, and I can't wait for your insights. In terms of question number 1, I want to take you to the first part of Claudia's brief around perhaps the plateau we have seen of offensive cyber operations in Ukraine. And I want to ask, perhaps starting with Ciaran and then moving to Mike, whether or not you have been surprised by the absence of, let's call it, decisive cyber operations by Russia against Ukraine. There's been no cyber Pearl Harbor, as some analysts might predict. And we're waiting to see if anything further will come out of that crisis. So, Ciaran, were you surprised? And where might this head next?
It depends on your starting point, Katherine, and just thanks to Claudia for that excellent briefing. And I think I would echo what you said at the start. The brutal reality of conventional warfare is there for all to see. So it's actually quite tricky and in some extent almost inappropriate to use the term cyber war in this space, given the reality of what's going on. The question of whether you're surprised or not does depend on the starting point. If your starting point is an assumption that any state-on-state war is going to be accompanied by cyber Pearl Harbor or cyber shock and awe, I'm not surprised that did not take place. I will defer to the former commander of the largest cyber force in the world, but I suspect he would agree that cyber operations are more subtle than that. The ones that take out things like power grids take an awfully long time. They take time, skill, infrastructure, and so forth. So in grey zone times, and although Russia and Ukraine have been in a state of lower intensity conflict since 2014, but short of full-scale invasion, the Russians will spend 18 months, 24 months, 30 months planning and executing these operations. But when they're actually invading a country, you can't invade a country with computers. So there was never going to be the sort of cyber shock and awe that some people who don't understand cyber operations were speculating about. Having said all that, I think Claudia's briefing got it right. The sort of activity we saw with the attacks on the banks with Viasat and so forth, that's in keeping with what's been going on in 2014, quite high-end disruptive operations, but it hasn't really intensified, and you might be a bit surprised. There are all sorts of theories as to why that might be. Maybe the cyber commanders were as unready as the rest of the Russian forces. Maybe it just wasn't part of the plan because they expected a quick victory. Who knows? I'm also, and again, Mike might have a better view on this, I'm also sort of slightly surprised by the lack of any coverage of sort of attacks on Ukrainian military systems. Now, of course, that's a murkier world to get a grip on because so much of it will be classified, and I certainly don't know from my perch whether a lot of this is being repelled or whether it's just not happening. And again, it does seem that the Russians have left the Ukrainian internet alone for various reasons, not least because they might want to use it themselves. So not surprised there hasn't been sort of cyber destruction, but a little bit surprised there's been so little. There hasn't really been an intensification. Where does this go? Well, I think, again, looking at the US posture and the CISA, the sort of the equivalent of our and Al's organizations, has got this slogan "Shields Up," which I think captures the position well. It's still a period of heightened risk. Claudia's briefing mentioned the NotPetya attack, and actually I think that sort of spillover, again, it hasn't really happened. The Viasat consequences weren't anything like as bad as NotPetya, not even close. But actually, were Russia to get even more desperate and decide that they might throw out some cyber attacks, actually poorly executed cyber attacks are quite a big risk, because NotPetya was a poorly executed cyber attack that went very, very badly wrong. So that's one risk to keep an eye on. Another risk is that the sort of another dog that hasn't barked is Russia's extensive network of cyber criminals. So the Conti group, who caused so much chaos in 2021, nothing to do with Ukraine, but serious social disruption in the West, pledged allegiance to Mother Russia and the war effort. They were undermined by some internal divisions. But the Russian state is sitting on 3/4 of the world's cyber criminality and some pretty sort of bad actors. So I think heightened awareness without panic is the way to go. I still think that when this conflict is over, probably when it's analysed, as it will be for years, people will take quite a sort of modest assessment of the role of cyber in it. But actually, I think what we mustn't do then is downgrade our assessment of the overall risk to our day-to-day lives, because there's a whole bunch of actors out there that we might come on to later who will continue to disrupt and seek to annoy and harass and hassle us in cyberspace.
Mike, I might bring you in at this point. Ciaran, there's so much in there to unpack, and we'll come back to a number of those things throughout our conversation. But one thing you alluded to is the fact that Russia has been using Ukraine as a test bed for offensive cyber operations for a decade almost. And Mike, I want to bring you in here. Hasn't Russia had time to experiment and prepare and pre-position for those types of decisive strikes that we might be looking to see?
Well, I think a couple of things from my perspective. Number one, there's more activity ongoing in Ukraine in cyber than I think we're actually seeing actively reported by the media. So no one should think for 1 minute that there's not a significant level of effort that's being played out. I'll be very honest and tell you, I hate the analogy of a cyber Pearl Harbor. I always said, guys, that is not the way this is going to work. It isn't going to be like that. My own government leaders in my previous life used to use this all the time, which just used to drive me up the wall, because I thought that's not the way this is going to unfold, you guys. I think we're seeing several factors play out. Number one, while no one should doubt the capabilities of Russia, both in terms of its own capabilities as a nation state, as well as some of the relationships that is created that gives it additional capacity or capability via the criminal arena. I think the Russians' view was, this is going to be over quickly. I'm going to need to use this infrastructure once I take over. And if I have to go destructive, I'm going kinetic. So I don't really need to spend a lot of time working on software if I can just use a bomb to strike the server center or the switching center. And the other thing I would make out, because if I was in my old job, I would be getting, okay, Mike, what can we do? It takes weeks and months to prepare cyber offensive effects against a focused and determined opponent. And the Ukrainians are one focused and determined opponent, and their shields are up. They are very aggressively looking at cyber defense as well as the offensive side. So, it takes some number of weeks to start working your way through this, because much of the configurations in the defensive side have been changing over the course of the last 6 weeks or so, both in the buildup to the invasion and since that invasion. I do worry personally, it's something that Ciaran raised. I worry about inadvertent escalation in the sense that both of the primary combatants, Russia and Ukraine, have turned to external actors to provide additional capacity, both defensively as well as offensively. And those individual actors are not governed by a tight set of controls. I don't think that they work necessarily the specificity of their targets through the respective governments. I think they're given broad direction to potentially create harm and have impact. And it's left up to them to say how they're going to do it. And so part of me worries, boy, we have never had a cyber conflict before where we have had so many second and third parties who are now active extensions of the primary combatants. And that brings a real strong potential for escalation. And that really worries me. I am going to disagree with Claudia on one particular thing. For my Australian and New Zealand teammates, much like the US, the EU, NATO, we have all made choices here. And now from the perspective of the Russians, we're on the opposite side. If you look at what Australia has done, you've sanctioned over 400 individuals and entities. Your central bank has shut down Russian ability to cash bonds. Your two largest investment funds are divesting themselves of Russian assets right now. They're dumping Russian assets. And several of your companies have announced they're pulling out. Likewise, New Zealand has announced a sanctions regime. So I would tell any nation or any business that has pulled out or come online publicly with comments against the Russians and what's going on. The flip side is you are now a target potentially in a way that you weren't before. I'm not criticizing the decision, but I think the implication is, guys, you got to be ready. And if I was in the Southern Hemisphere, I wouldn't be thinking to myself, well, don't worry, the Russians are just going to go after the US or NATO. I just don't think that's the way the Russians are thinking. I think their view of what you're going to see play out in the coming weeks and months is Putin is trying to figure out, so how can he create economic pain for those who are doing the same thing to him? How can he disrupt the cohesion, which I think has really surprised him, the cohesion of these 30 plus nations that have announced this very robust sanction regime. No nation in the world has ever received the sanctions that the Russians are dealing with now. And thirdly, I think they're going to want to create some measure. It won't be the same around the world, but within those 30 plus nations, I believe the Russians are also going to be asking themselves, how do we create internal domestic disruption, loss of cohesion? And I'm not saying Australia is number one on the target. It's much more likely probably going to be aimed at us because it's a continuation of things the Russians have been doing anyways. But we're all making choices these days, and the Russians are, in some ways, I think, going to be in the coming weeks and months reminding us about the fact we've made a choice against them.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
You can take my job.
Well, okay. Well, you do it much better. I wanted to ask Mike a question. Firstly, on what he was just saying then. Do you think that the most likely scenario of Russia doing something against Australia would be a sort of a supply chain attack? And I think Claudia was talking about those things. I mean, the reality is they've shown a great propensity for doing that with software. Whether or not that might be the vector where we're just almost inadvertently captured in something that they're doing more broadly against the West. And then the question to both of you following is, with those sanctions biting, could we also see the state of Russia doing what we've seen, particularly North Korea doing, which is then hacks to create cash flow into a regime that will be increasingly desperate for non-ruble currencies?
We might throw to Ciaran or Mike as he starts. We'll throw to Mike first for that and then follow up with Ciaran.
I apologize. Ciaran, you go ahead. I spoke last. Ciaran, you go ahead.
Well, very quickly, because I'd rather hear your answer to both questions. I think on the, will they do in North Korea and just go and hack for money? I mean, I think it's possible, but the amounts of money, even in the age of ransomware, will not be, I think, sufficient to fund the sort of effort required to get around sanctions and fund this enormous war machine. I think actually, and this is a long-term risk, both Russia and Ukraine play host to significant volumes of cyber criminals. And whatever happens, whether this conflict's frozen, whether there's some sort of uneasy peace deal or so forth, sadly, particularly in Ukraine, but also for Russian civilians, these are not going to be happy, stable, economically prosperous countries for some time to come. And they've got lots of well-organized, skilled people, good with computers, needing to eke out an existence. And it is equally unlikely that full rule of law across all the territories will apply with robust law enforcement in a way that we in our countries would understand it. Therefore, I think that actually that sort of 2021 style cyber instability against us from criminality is here for a very, very long time, regardless of what happens. I'm not sure they'll go down the North Korea route. They might do it a bit. I think the strategic risk that would worry me is that if someone in the Kremlin saw the strategic value of organized cyber criminality from within Russia and just told those people to go and create as much havoc as they could, it's semi-deniable because it's criminals and so forth, but it could make life quite uncomfortable for us.
And Mike, we've seen warnings come out of US authorities, UK authorities, and also Australian authorities. And we've seen in recent years Russia publicly attributed for these types of massive supply chain attacks that we've seen. Is that the most likely or a likely type of attack to Alastair's point that we might see? And Australia, of course, as a consumer of global software products, might well be caught up in that type of spillover effect.
Yeah, so let me answer two questions. So first, remember the North Korean model is cyber as a tool to rob banks, mine cryptocurrency, and go after sites where they know there's lots of activities. They love to hang around gaming and pornographic sites because they know that's where a massive amount of users go. Like Ciaran, I don't think that's the Russians' initial approach to this. I think they're much more likely to turn to their surrogates, the criminal element in particular, and just say, have at it. Just let's create a lot of disruption more broadly, which will be interesting. Remember, businesses, for example, have always dealt with criminal penetrations largely for the purposes of theft of IP or generation of revenue in the form of ransomware. What happens if the vector now is the criminals don't want to raise money? They don't care about any of that stuff. Now it's all, they just want to disrupt, degrade, lock down. That's a whole different world for businesses and the private sector to deal with. In terms of what do I think are the most likely Russians' threat vectors if the state determines they want to do it? The first point I would make is supply chain attacks normally take months. I mean, to do a good supply chain attack, you generally got to spend months focused on it. So I don't think it's their first reaction. I think you're going to see two different approaches. One is they're going to be very focused and very targeted on government. For Australia, I would argue it's not going to be military. Government sites to generally show their displeasure, and then potentially a couple economic targets just to create some measure. It won't be massive across the board, I don't think. And the two scenarios in terms of execution to me are, is it very focused against those targets, or do you get into a NotPetya, inadvertent, second and third order effect? Because quite frankly, they don't care about collateral damage right now. I don't think that's going to be a big inhibitor. I mean, it wasn't in 2017. I think they're even less inclined to worry about that right now. So I would, if I was a business that had severed my ties in Russia or made significant public comments, or I was in the Australian government, those are the primary vectors I think that the Russians would be interested in. And a supply chain probably wouldn't be their initial one because that takes months to really set up and prep well.
I want to take us away a little bit from the conflict zone now. We're talking about very capable cyber powers, Russia, Ukraine. I want to take us to another cyber power not directly involved in this conflict, which is China, and one we think about a lot down under. And I want to ask, I'll start, Alastair, with you this time, and then move to Mike and then Ciaran. We know, and we've seen reporting of an increase in Chinese cyber espionage activities against Ukraine. And my question to the panel is, what do we think China is looking for? What type of, if I can use that word, learnings do we think China will take away from what we're seeing and what we're not seeing in the cyber dimension of this conflict? And what potentially are we missing while all eyes are on Russia, Ukraine? Alastair.
I'd much prefer to hear from these two. Well, I suspect they'd be a bit disappointed, frankly. I would have thought China would expect Russia to have been more effective with whatever its cyber campaigns have been leading up to this. To that concept of preparation, they've had a long time to prepare. And I wonder whether, Ciaran made reference to this, those organizations, the Russian organizations that do this type of cyber activity were as caught off guard as clearly the generals on the ground seem to have been. So I suspect they would look at a command and control issue, make sure that whoever has to pull the virtual trigger knows that they've got to do it. But again, Russia's been very active in Ukraine, literally for a long time. And I suspect China would be as surprised as most of us at the ineffective nature of it. Well, that's my ill-educated view. But again, I think the audience want to hear from what Ciaran and Mike would say on such matters.
Mike, do you think the Chinese are surprised?
For me, number one, something you raised, the only source so far we've seen about significant Chinese activity in Ukraine is Ukrainian source. I'd like to get a little independent verification about this to get a sense for it. I will say historically, in my previous life, every time we saw significant cyber activity in one segment of the world, the Chinese always used it as an opportunity to really jack up their standing levels of activity. At times, I always thought they were thinking our attention was diverted elsewhere. NotPetya is a good example. We saw the Chinese really ramp up their activity in the aftermath of NotPetya. I thought because their view was we were going to be distracted elsewhere. I think the broad lessons, look, I think that this conflict will be a watershed event in the history of cyber war. I believe you're going to see the Chinese really looking at this For the first time, both of the primary combatants have turned to create, if you will, crowdsourcing for offensive and defensive cyber capability at scale. We've never seen that before. Both of the primary combatants have turned to surrogates in many ways to try to help them. First time we've seen independent groups like Anonymous decide they're going to assert themselves in the middle of an armed conflict and use cyber as a tool to express their viewpoint. And the other thing, and I think this is particularly interesting for the Chinese model, for the first time, you are seeing both on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, significant private, to include some US firms, who are providing significant cybersecurity, cyber defensive capability, and in the case of the Russians, some offensive capability. I wonder if the Chinese are going to be looking at that and arguing, hey, we need to be thinking about how we access the significant private sector capabilities within China in the cyber arena as the Russians and the Ukrainians have done. And I'll be honest, that is not the Western model. That is not what in the US, the UK, that's not what we normally plan for in these kinds of scenarios. I wonder if you're going to see that change going forward.
As I throw to you, Ciaran, I want to just throw another shade of the question into the mix, which is that this talk about the role of cyber partisans and let's call them digital foreign fighters in this conflict. Mike's mentioned that that might be something other cyber powers are looking at, saying, oh, this is a great idea, get the patriotic hackers on board. As I turn to you, I'd also like you to perhaps to offer some reflections on the effectiveness of this approach. So we've seen Ukraine recruit via some very unorthodox means, Google Forms, Telegram messages, allegedly up to 300,000 members of the IT army in Ukraine. But of course, not all members who've answered that call may in fact be Ukrainian or allied to Ukraine. So what are the potential risks, limitations, even how effective are these groups rallying to the Ukrainian cause?
Well, just first quickly on China, I think I strongly endorse what Mike said about they will be studying this from years to come. And China has always been a very different cyber power to Russia in terms of its operations. It didn't do as many of those big destructive attacks as Russia did, and probably may well conclude that they may be of more limited value, but will have looked very carefully at this sort of crowdsourcing, this harassment and so forth, and they'll be looking at that very carefully. I think we want to be really careful about over-interpreting China's actions in Ukraine. I mean, I think the story broke in a British paper, and to a lot of technical experts, routine port scanning was elevated into a massive cyber attack. And given that, everyone will be interested in what's happening in Ukraine and trying to find out some ground truth as to what's going on, I think you can certainly overinterpret that, and given the geopolitical consequences, had it been a massive collusive with Russia cyber attack, I think we need to be a bit careful about this. I do think in terms of China right now, they, as Mike said, the world order is being rewritten by this conflict in ways that we don't know. And China, with its strategic patience, will be, I imagine, taking advantage of Western distraction to actually try and figure out what the West is doing. And so its own espionage against the West will be on the up. And of course, all the while, it's got its own long-term economic and strategic objectives that it seeks to pursue through cyberspace. And it'll just keep on going with that, again, as Mike says, at a time when we are distracted. So I think there's actually quite a significant amount of Chinese cyber activity on the scene at the moment, often against the West. In terms of the sort of non-state actors and so forth, there's a lot of fog of war around this. It's hard to get ground truth. There's a lot of activity going on. I think on effectiveness, it depends what you're assessing. If you're assessing altering the strategic outcome of the war kinetically, I don't see any impact at all. If you're looking at the information contest, it's been a very effective victory for Ukraine, and it's been that's. But it doesn't translate into, if one of the purpose of cyber operations, and this is one of the principal purposes of cyber operations, is to change the behavior of your adversary. I'm not sure that DDoSing the Kremlin's website or messing around a little bit on Russian state media is going to change Putin's activity, but it does help you with the information sort of battle. But the risks have already been covered by Mike. It's quite interesting. There's a fascinating interview with a man called Viktor Zhora, who is a senior official at the Ukrainian Civilian Cybersecurity Bureau, the one that looks after sort of civilian critical infrastructure, to the Washington Post. And he was putting a little bit of he was putting a little bit of distance into this. He was saying, they're not operating under the sort of chain of command. I don't want them to do things that are risky and escalatory and so forth. And I think there is quite a lot of skepticism in the West about the wisdom of and the escalatory risks and the accidental sort of not petty risks about some of this. And of course, of accepting a moral premise, which then would apply in peacetime, that if someone feels strongly enough about something, then they can take matters into their own keyboards, into their own fingers on keyboards, and achieve an effect, whether that's about climate activism or immigration or whatever, or whatever it is. So I think we want to be a little bit careful about some of this.
It's the age-old question, I suppose, of mobilisation and then the costs and risks of demobilisation, whether we're talking physical or digital fighters. I want to then pick up on something that we've mentioned a few times now, which is the information dimension of this contest. Maybe cyber doesn't do destruction, but it can disrupt and it can aid a support for a cause. And one of the main players in the information contest in Russia, Ukraine, has actually been global technology platforms. We're talking Meta, Facebook, Google, TikTok even has been weighing in on this conflict. And my question to the group is, are we seeing a moment in history where the power of these digital platforms to potentially deprive Russia of a platform, to, as we've seen in the case of Google, deprive Russian soldiers of situational awareness on the ground by turning off certain features of Google Maps? Are we seeing the power of digital platforms coming out in a really new and different way that will shape the future? And also, because of the power of many of these Western platforms, we're already seeing a reaction in Russia to ban a number of these platforms and a movement towards a more of a walled garden approach to Russia's internet than it ever had before. Will we also see an acceleration or perhaps an irrevocable move towards separate internet systems between US and its allies and authoritarian countries like Russia, China, and others? Mike, I'll go to you first and then go to Alastair and round back with Ciaran.
Sure. So I would argue right now it's the information dimensions of cyber that have had the greatest impact so far, really, much more than cyber is a disruptive tool, if you will. It'll be interesting. It's one of the areas we really need to study as this unfolds and once it's over. What was the impact of all of this? What are the implications? Does disruption of fundamental social platforms, does it have second and third order effect that we haven't really seen before? Because we haven't had to deal with this before. With respect to this idea of Russian separation, look, it's something the Russians have been talking about for several years. I personally believe this will be one of the areas that the Russians will be turning to China on. How can you help us create more internet, more World Wide Web independence? How can you help us create greater controls and awareness of information flows in and out? I do think this is an area you're going to see the two nations cooperating on much more, because this is an area where the Chinese have made significant investments and really have some interesting capabilities, and they have put it at scale. I mean, Russia's down to a population of 145 million right now. China at about 1.4 billion. China much more much more connected, much more IT centric than Russia as a nation. But I think the Russians are going to be looking for that kind of expertise.
Well, back to one of those issues that you asked before about China learnings. I think one of the great lessons from this is Ukraine has certainly taken, their message has a lot more cut through on the public internet than Russia's, right? They're saying everything is fabricated when Ukraine is showing electronically the proof of everything from mass graves through to, other, actions by Russian forces. So I think that's a key learning for China back on the other one. And it also shows the power of being able to directly take an unfiltered message out to the world. So if you follow Ukraine Ministry for Defense, you see the footage that's unfiltered that obviously the media houses have to cover off. So it shows the power of the internet for unfiltered messaging. Those who know me know that I think we're heading towards a world where there is a bifurcated or even a more fractured internet. To Mike's point, Russia has already been experimenting with how they would cut themselves off. China has proven that they can largely. I don't think they can stop all information circulating in China. I think all totalitarian regimes will be brought down because of that attempt to hold information. And we all know the great benefits of sharing information on a free and open internet. But to me, the most important question keeps coming down to critical technologies. So the internet, of course, being a layer of connected technologies, but the thing that is really going to matter most, and I think this conflict, this war will drive us to this, is where we pick technology being created, where it's run from, where it's manufactured in, will matter more and more to the West, just as it will to those who don't have the West's best interests at heart. I think Mike's right. Russia will look to China for that, and we should look away from China for our critical technologies. We started that as a country, and I think that we will continue to pursue that at pace. This conflict, if nothing else, will hasten the demise of a global internet of free information sharing. I don't think that's always a bad thing, Katherine, as you know. I'll finish on this point. We see the huge benefits of sharing information. We get all of the negatives of disinformation and misinformation from those very countries that are not there to help our democracies. Those countries don't get all of our toxicity put back on them because they filter it. All totalitarian regimes have been filtering telephony and internet for such a long time. This will just hasten that division. But I'd be really keen on Ciaran's views too, of course.
Well, I'm lucky going last here because main points have already been said, and that's great because it's nearly 2 o'clock in the morning here. But just one point of embellishment and one point of sort of one slightly different and slightly provocative point. The point of embellishment is on this balkanization of the internet, splinternet, whatever you want to call it. I think it's happening anyway. And Russia can't balkanize the internet because all Russia can do is block off other people's technology. It doesn't really have a technological base of its own. So it can shut out, as it is doing, it can shut out Twitter and Google and all the Western platforms, but it hasn't got a great deal. Indeed, there was a bit of concern when people like Microsoft were pulling out of Russia, were any actual sort of critical systems going to be patched and things like that. Whereas China has its own technological system already. It's pretty good. They try and export it. So, and that was happening anyway. I agree with Al that it's probably going to accelerate that. On the point about the information contest, I think I agree with everything that's been said about the importance of it. I think the Russians will rue the mistake of, from their point of view, of leaving the Ukrainian internet largely on because they've used it spectacularly effectively to shore up. I mean, President Zelensky has relentlessly exploited it on a daily basis to magnificent effect in putting pressure on the West and convincing Western public opinion. But one bit of challenge is what changes Russian minds, and none of this really does. Whether it's the effectiveness of Ukrainian government and those who support them across the world, that doesn't get into Russia and have much of an impact. It has a bit, but not that much. The hacktivist stuff, again, if you look at reputable polling, I'm not a geopolitical expert, let alone a Russia expert, but if you read polling by reputable Western companies done within Russia, the Putin nationalist narrative is sort of holding up in some spaces. There isn't the sort of domestic pressure. So I think the only note of caution I use on this, information narrative, I think it is clearly hugely effective in rallying the West and Ukraine's allies. But let's not forget let's not forget the question, how does this play out in Russia? Because obviously one of the things that could be a game changer is withdrawal of enough popular support for Putin that the regime comes under severe pressure. And it's not doing that yet, as far as I can see.
Ciaran, you make the point that
if I could,
the information contest hasn't influenced the popular mind in Russia. But could you perhaps contend that the way the West has wielded information, and here I'm thinking about publicising intelligence about war plans, often based on signals intelligence, and I'll come to Mike on that point in a second, but could you argue that maybe that's changed or influenced elite decision-making? There is some argument out there that the way in which the West has wielded information revealing Putin's war plans, for instance, may have in fact wrong-footed Putin, or delayed his plans, or caused him to make strategic blunders. Is that one area of the information contest where there is some influence on the Russian side?
I would tentatively agree, and I'm only tentative because I wouldn't be confident enough in my own judgment, but I think it's very plausible. It's obviously a different issue, and I know Mike wanted to come back on the points that we were just talking about the other part of the information war, so I'll cede the floor to him, I think.
Yeah, I think the short answer is, number one, we don't know. I will say, to me, it was not by chance that you saw a separation between the initial Russian penetration into the Donbass and then about a 36-hour segment before they went into broader Ukraine. I thought he wanted to punch into the Donbass. He wanted to see how the West reacted. And remember, the West's initial reaction was they had said, if you invade, you trigger this massive set of sanctions. When he went into the Donbass, what they actually said was, we're going to go with a lighter set up front as a way to try to convince you don't want to go any further. But we are not going to necessarily go with the full range right now. I think history will show that was a mistake. I think he looked at that and thought, they told me they were going to hit me as soon as I came in. They really didn't. They're weak. I'm going to keep going. It'll be interesting to see if that's true or not. But I thought Ciaran makes a really important point. As we look at the information dynamic here, I don't think either side has been able to use information to significantly alter perceptions in the opposite camp, or to use information to change respective government policies or actions on the other side. I think Putin was going to do this anyway, and I think the West was committed to this idea. So it'll be interesting to see if that's true, and if the post-mortems that we'll get as we get more insight here over time, what are the implications then to the use of information going forward? Is this just an aberration, or is this much more, the norm in the future? Is it just a reflection of the dynamic with Russia? Because as Ciaran said, one thing I always talk about in the United States, look, the way the West views this is totally different than the average citizen in Russia. They're in a totally different camp. Putin does not have significant domestic political pressure right now. Now, he might down the road, but he doesn't really right now.
I wonder whether he'll get more as bodies return to be buried of Russian troops. There's been some really interesting open source sort of mining of Russian wives and mothers and relatives talking on the internet and pushing that back out to the West to show their response. And on that, I'd be really keen on the views of the guys online as to the role of non-SIGINT, just that amount of information that's out there, and the ability to cross-reference it. There was a fantastic US newspaper report that had in the clear communications coming from Russian troops that were then triangulated and geo-mapped to mobile phone footage that was taken in the streets of Ukraine, where you could actually then place it on a map. It's the type of thing we've never seen before, and there's this type of conflict. So I'm wondering the role, Ciaran and Mike, that sort of public information will now play in terms of shaping our thoughts, obviously in the West on one side, but also what role it plays for military planners and intelligence services that are involved in conflicts, now that you can use an IP camera that's sitting on the edge of a building or a mobile phone that's uploading stuff to a cloud. What role do you think that does to disrupting our biggest centralized systems that we have in all these countries?
Ciaran, you want to
start with you? Or Mike, who's on screen.
Okay, I'll go first. Number one, the role of Western businesses. Think about space-based imagery. Think about synthetic aperture radar that's commercially produced. Think about what we would call in government SIGINTs, but active interceptive communications, overlaying geographic locations, and then making that commercially available is amazing. We have never seen this kind of commercial, business applications to generating insight on battlefield activities. We've never seen this level before, literally anywhere in the world. Again, I think this is a norm for the future. I always believed, as the director of NSA, I didn't view it as competition. My view is this generates even more situational awareness, more capability to help decision makers make smarter policy choices, to help military commanders make smarter choices. I viewed it as, look, we should look at this as an integrated capability that we provide to decision makers. It shouldn't just be about what does exquisite SIGINT or humans tell you. It's the combination of all of this, which again, I think you're going to see going forward. And the last point I would make is it also gives you a measure of plausible deniability or cover. You can now honestly say, well, that really came from a commercial, capability, in a way that, 3 years ago, we would have been saying, there's no really alternative here. We really can't tie this to a commercial capability as a cover for the source we're using. We better not release this. It's interesting how that has helped to change the dynamic.
Yeah, for my part, I think I would agree with what Mike's just said. And I think on open source and its impact and the huge instant coverage of developments on the ground and all this, I think one thing that will be very interesting in the long run, and again, I come back to this sort of obsession I have on what changes opponent behavior. In the last 24, 48 hours following the horrors that have been revealed, what's been very interesting is a concerted effort by NGOs and to some extent governments all over the world to begin to collate this stuff for potential war crimes proceedings. Now that again is something that is without precedent. I mean, obviously war crimes tribunals have precedents, but the sort of objective at the moment at which these atrocities happen to begin to compile evidence of perpetrators, of impact, of even the most difficult part, establishing chains of command and orders and so forth to hold those at the top more accountable. I wonder, and it's far too early to say, but I wonder, will that have an impact of some of these people, particularly as we know from the casualties, the Russians have deployed quite senior people very far into theater. Half a dozen or more generals have lost their lives already, as we know. So clearly there may be evidence that you can get from open source. In the past, a lot of this would have been sensitive state capabilities and people would have really struggled to compile this information quickly. So one, I still, as per the last discussion that Mike and I had, I still don't think at the minute this sort of information battle, whilst it's been clearly won by Ukraine outside of Russia, is having much of an impact in Russia itself. But I think this is a potentially interesting part of it. If you're sort of middle or senior in the Russian military, the Russian government, the reality that this is going badly, that some things are being committed, and that there is a crowdsourced activist base all over the world trying to document literally everything using all these capabilities that Mike spoke of, with the explicit purpose of when this is all over, holding people to account for what they did. That could potentially be an interesting development, but only time will tell.
In the last couple of minutes of the dialogue now, knowing it's gusting 2 a.m. for you, Ciaran, I want to draw all of you out on a final question around implications and a bit of future casting. So you've all led the peak cyber agencies or peak cyber agencies within your home countries. You've all provided advice to the leaders of your countries. And so this is the question I want to end on is this. It's a two-part question. The first is, if you had to advise your country, UK, US, Australia today, about the most important take home from this conflict and what they could do now to make their citizens safer to prepare for future conflict and future cyber security problems, what would that one thing be, that one piece of advice? And then the second part is, if you, now you all sit outside government, if you were talking to the corporate sector, to private sector organisations, they're all looking towards Ukraine, Russia, wondering about the implications for them. What would your top piece of advice be for those organisations about what Russia, Ukraine means for them, not just now in terms of their risk, but as they look to defend themselves and protect themselves over the next 12 months, 18 months, 5 years even? Alastair, I'll start with you.
Oh, thanks so much, Katherine.
Two answers.
I'll be really quick because I really want to hear Ciaran and Mike, of course. First thing I'd say is that in terms of the first bit, what would the learnings be? I still don't think we've unpicked what the electronic warfare component of this has been, the cyber warfare bit, whether there has been impact on each other's forces. And I wonder whether that's because it's pretty aging equipment that you see in the field. But I still think that's an uncharted bit. There'll be a lot of learnings, which I think a lot of countries will be watching to see what was done electronically in the field versus those broader cyber attacks that Claudia spoke about, if that makes sense.
The tactical,
yes,
versus
the tactical, how's the connected soldier impacted in this, or a tank or a plane or a ship? What we don't know is that yet, I think, but a lot of countries will be studying that. And that, as you know, the more connected we make our soldiers, sailors and airmen and women, the more vectors for attack and disruption there are. So I think that's a really big thing to look at, and that'll be unpicked over time. If I was talking to industry today, and we talk to them every day, well, we've got new legislation in this country, very significant legislation that codifies 11 critical infrastructure sectors and their increased responsibility towards cyber resilience, as well as their physical security and their understanding of who works in critical parts of those sectors. That is groundbreaking legislation. It's really significant for our country. That'll increase cyber resilience along with the actual resilience of those critical infrastructure sectors. And the key message there is your security doesn't begin and end at the curtilage of your properties. It's that supply chain thing. So it's going to go down to software and hardware, who your suppliers are that you rely upon. Log4j was a classic example of where you could look for Log4j vulnerabilities in your own systems, then you had to ask the providers of software to you whether they've got it in there, and then they had to ask their suppliers. And it just highlighted the supply chain issue when it comes to security. But to me, there's a really important regulatory shift that we've seen in this geography, and that will push a lot of resilience that, by the way, I think will be really important if there was ever armed conflict that we were involved in, because we know, as we've seen in Ukraine, just as I tie it back, that critical infrastructure will be impacted by whoever an adversary is. And
just to disambiguate for non-cyber players, Log4j was a widely exploited vulnerability that ruined Christmas for many in the InfoSec community. Nation states, criminals, everyone piled in on that massive vulnerability late last year. I might now go to Ciaran, and then Mike, I'll give you the last word. Ciaran, what are your top two pieces of advice?
Really quickly, well, one bit for government and then one bit for both of them. The bit just for government is, I think we could do, when this is over with, just a realistic appraisal of what this tells us about cyber capabilities in conflict. Like Mike, I had years of this guff about cyber Pearl Harbors. We just put a U in the harbour, but apart from that, it was exactly the same rhetoric. And what we've seen now, the reality of cyber in war, has implications for the way we think about both defense and offense. The thing for both is really easy. It's about digital resilience in the homeland. I think it's worth remembering the question, even if cyber continues in terms of direct damage to the West to be lower than we might have expected in this sort of situation, it's worth remembering, what were we scared of and what are we still scared of? And it's not a cyber Pearl Harbor. It's just this outbreak of large-scale digital disruption, hassle, harassment, and so forth. Why are we scared of that? Because we know that we're not resilient enough. We know we've got too much legacy IT. We know that we're just too easy to mess around, whether it's healthcare administration, pipeline administration, food retail, logistics, that sort of thing. So long-term, both government and business, a real push on digital resilience.
Yeah, boy, I agree. Great insights from Alastair and Ciaran. If I was in my former roles, what I would be saying to the president now would be, number one, it's going to get worse before it gets better. So let's not assume that a month into this, that we fully understand it and we've dealt with everything that we're going to have to. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. Number two, we need to think about what is the role of governments with the protection of digital infrastructure as an element of a conflict in which businesses in the private sector are now going to be targets in a war. Historically, businesses, the private sector, was focused for three primary reasons: theft of intellectual property, espionage, or criminal activity, the generation of revenue. Potentially what we're going to see unfold in the coming weeks and months is some measure of Russian activity where it is about none of those things. It is now about disruption. It is about inflicting pain. It is about degrading. It's about using cyber as a tool for a broader political and domestic impact, which again, we just have never seen before. And if that's true, what is the expectation of government? Government's role is to defend its, its citizens and its nation. We've never really applied that so much in cyber. We've generally said, it's up to you, just like we have police, but they don't defend your factory. You put in fences, you put in locks, you put on lights, you use security to patrol it. We'll respond if there's an incident, but we're not responsible for protecting it day to day per se. I wonder if that's really holds true going forward. What I would tell business is resilience, resilience, resilience. That's what we really need to focus on. We're not at the point now where if you think you're going to swap out and do massive system upgrades and totally change your defensive capabilities in the coming weeks, that's got a low probability of success. Your greatest return is focusing on how you become more resilient.
Mike, Ciaran, Alastair, thank you so much for your insights this morning. It's been an absolute privilege talking with all of you. It is going to take a long time for us to digest what the Ukraine-Russia war means for cyber and for geopolitics more broadly, but I think we've made a creditable start this morning. Thank you so much for your time. I would encourage all of the viewers out there, if you've enjoyed this Cyber Dialogue, please visit CyberCX's website. We post a lot of content like this, blogs, insights to help organisations understand what events mean like this for them. And we'll also have a copy of this in due course. So thank you to the panel. Thank you to Claudia for her intelligence brief. And of course, thank you to you, the audience, for staying with us this morning. And I look forward to the next Cyber Dialogue that we host.
Hey, well, everybody. Well done, Ciaran, at 2 in the morning.
Thank you, everybody.